Yesterday on the show, we were speaking with St. John City Councillor Gary Sullivan, and Councillor Sullivan is reopening this whole conversation at City Hall about an anti-suicide barrier on the Reversing Falls Bridge. Now, Sullivan says that a few weeks ago, someone close to him witnessed a suicide, and it's clear that this is a regular occurrence.
In 2017, when we looked at this, in the first 6 months of 2017, the St. John Police Force had 21 files that either missing persons or mental health act where the Reversing Falls Bridge was mentioned as part of that. So that was 21 files in the first 6 months of the year. So, it doesn't take a genius to say that's 40-ish in a year. Because I'm a boater, I see our firefighter boat and the Coast Guard going often, and when they leave the RKYC and take a left, quite often the guess is pretty good that they're heading to the Reversing Falls.
Some sobering numbers there from St. John City Councillor Gary Sullivan. Dr. Simon Sherry is a proponent of these kinds of bridge barriers. Now, he is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Dalhousie University, and he's also a practicing psychiatrist who treats people with suicidal thoughts. Good morning.
Good morning.
What do we know about how well these kinds of barriers work?
There is evidence that suicide barriers are an effective means of suicide prevention. There are more than a dozen studies that contribute to that conclusion, and that includes Canadian research on the Bloor Viaduct in Toronto, as well as the Jacques Cartier Bridge in Montreal.
So we have more than a dozen studies that tells us this works? I mean, why do they work?
Certain places over time acquire the property of becoming what you might call a suicide hotspot. These hotspots have a reputation and a notoriety. They often involve iconic locations and receive media attention. At that point, people will disproportionately go to die by suicide in such a location. It then becomes critically important to reduce access to that means of dying by suicide through doing things like erecting barriers.
But even when a place develops that kind of reputation you're talking about, sometimes the community still has a hard time getting a barrier put in. I mean, in Halifax, not far from us here in St. John, New Brunswick, this took years. Why is that?
There are a lot of myths surrounding suicide. One is that suicide is not preventable, and we know through extensive data that that's absolutely false. Two other myths that you'll see surrounding suicide barriers on bridges in particular involve the ideas of substitution and displacement. Substitution is the incorrect idea that if somebody doesn't die by jumping, they'll just go home and die by alternative means. But evidence suggests that a suicide barrier actually lowers the suicide rate in the region where it is put up. The other idea, which is false, is the idea of displacement. This being, if somebody was going to jump off one bridge and their opportunity is blocked, they'll simply go and do it in another location. But this also runs contrary to the evidence that we have that suicide barriers reduce the overall suicide rate in communities where they're put up.
So let me get this straight. If we put like a net or a barrier under our bridge or over our bridge, we could see a decrease in suicide as a whole by overdose and by other means as well? Is that what you're saying?
You would see a decrease overall in the suicide rate. I couldn't speak to a specific reduction in something like overdose, but on the basis of research, you can reasonably predict that the suicide rate in the community overall would go down.
That's astonishing. What do we know about why people choose certain bridges, let's say, over others?
There are a number of things that can make one geographical area a magnet as opposed to another. One of it will certainly be media attention. Another factor is the aesthetics surrounding the bridge. If it is a bridge that has a certain visual appeal or is set in a spectacular and attractive location, then people seem disproportionately to go there. One example in the extreme would be the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, where since 1937, more than 1,600 people have died by suicide in that iconic location. It carries with it a big reputation.
You've mentioned something a few times here, which is the media attention to certain locations that make it more attractive to people who seek to commit suicide. I mean, what is your professional opinion about what these discussions in the media do to either fuel or prevent suicide?
On the one hand, I think that discussions like the one we're having here this morning are enormously important because to erect a suicide barrier, you need not only the available evidence, but also the political will and the public interest to actually follow through and implement that evidence. And I see a discussion like today as part of mobilizing that political will. On the other hand, there is concerning research that suggests that the more you talk about a given location, the more likely you are to create a suicide hotspot there. And the suicide behaviors in a particular location will directly co-vary with the amount of media attention that location receives.
Well, it's important to strike that balance, it would seem.
It is, and it's important to engage in responsible discussions around suicide as we are here today.
How important is it, just finally, sir, to deter that initial urge to attempt suicide?
It's vitally important. Means reduction is one of the best strategies we have available for suicide prevention. And research will consistently tell us that people make a final decision to make a lethal or near-lethal suicide attempt in only a matter of minutes. And something like a suicide barrier is often a very effective means of keeping someone safe and keeping someone from making an impulsive decision.
Let's say you see someone on a bridge about to make an impulsive decision like that. Like, how would you advise that someone intervene, or should they?
I absolutely think somebody should intervene. And in the meantime, the community where the suicide hotspot is occurring can do other proactive things. At the present time, you could be putting up signs or phones that encourage help seeking. It would also be very possible to increase third-party help on the bridge where there were more security patrols, for example. Another thing that should actively be considered would be limiting pedestrian access to the bridge. For example, I'm not sure that people should have access to this bridge in the evening. I'm not sure it serves any value to tourists at 2 a.m. in the morning. There would also be the option before a final sixth barrier goes up to erect a temporary barrier.
Dr. Sherry, thank you for this.
You're welcome. If I could point out one last thing, too. I think there has been an erroneous argument launched that it's too expensive to prevent suicide in this location. And I'll remind you of evidence from 1999, which is clearly out of date, that suggests the average cost of somebody dying by suicide in New Brunswick exceeds $850,000. So even when you make a cold, rational economic argument that somehow it's too expensive, that argument doesn't hold up. There are enormous individual and emotional and societal costs to death by suicide.
It's an important point. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
That's Dr. Simon Sherry. He's a practicing psychiatrist and a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Dalhousie University. Well, after we had Councillor Gary Sullivan on the show yesterday, a lot of you wrote in with your thoughts on this issue. I'm just going to read some of those responses now. Matt Pitt says, staggering numbers. He's referring to those numbers from 2017 that indicated in just 6 months, over 20 missing persons cases and mental health calls to police had some link to reversing Falls Bridge. He says, this is a sign it's time to do something. Doing nothing seems negligent. But Drew points out on Twitter, mental health concerns aren't one-dimensional. We can talk about giving more support to programs while also doing something that will immediately impact this current situation. It's possible, he says, to have that bigger conversation about mental health services in St. John, as well as putting up a physical barrier. Darren Johnson says he's torn with this one. If a person wants to commit suicide, he says they will find a way regardless. Perhaps we should focus money and time on improving access to mental health, PTSD, etc. Well, Phil Tabor says there's a comparison to be made to the McDonald Bridge in Halifax. He says the barrier there impedes the view a bit, but it has dramatically cut down on jumping since it was installed in 2009. A chain link fence won't suffice, he says. Likely a Halifax-type barrier is needed. Adam Kierstead wrote in saying that the real barrier is access to mental health services. He says mental health care in New Brunswick is horrifyingly bad. It needs a complete overhaul and substantially more resources. But even if the foundational issues were better addressed, there's absolutely no reason, he says, not to take steps to prevent impulsive decisions. Well, thank you so much to everyone who wrote in with your thoughts on this. There's lots more that we couldn't read, including lots of people who shared their stories of their own mental health struggles. And I got to say, if you are experiencing suicidal thoughts, if this is something that you're struggling with, I personally hope that you really reach out for help. The number for the CHIMO hotline, if you need it or someone you know needs it, is 1-800-668-5005.